The train arrives exactly on time. It always does in Tokyo. The doors open, passengers file in, the chime sounds, and within seconds, the train is moving again. It's a rhythm so precise, so dependable, that millions of people build their entire lives around it. On the morning of November 11th, 2007, 21-year-old Asami Chida followed this rhythm just as she had done countless times before. She left her apartment, walked to the station, and stepped onto a train heading toward her university. Somewhere between her home and her destination, in a journey that should have taken less than an hour, Asami Chida vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace. What makes a person disappear in one of the most surveilled, organized, and populated cities on Earth? How does someone evaporate in broad daylight on a route they've taken hundreds of times, surrounded by thousands of witnesses who saw nothing? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if it could happen to her on an ordinary Monday morning, doing something as mundane as taking the train to school, what does that say about the invisible boundaries between safety and oblivion? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions that have haunted investigators, devastated a family, and turned one unremarkable commute into one of Japan's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries. Because Asami Chida didn't just disappear, she dissolved into a system so organized, so documented, so watched, that her absence should have been impossible. And yet, 17 years later, no one knows what happened to her. Before she became a case file, a missing person poster, and a name whispered in true crime circles, Asami Chida was simply a young woman trying to build a life. Born in 1986 in Saitama Prefecture, just north of Tokyo, Asami grew up in the kind of environment that millions of Japanese families would recognize: structured, supportive, and centered around education and family values. Her parents, both working class, had instilled in her a strong work ethic and a quiet determination to succeed. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't rebellious, she was, by nearly every account, dependable. Asami had an older brother, and by all accounts the siblings were close. The family dynamic was stable, warm even, though reserved in the way many Japanese families present themselves to the outside world. There were no reports of domestic turmoil, no financial crises, no fractures beneath the surface. If anything, Asami's upbringing was almost aggressively normal, the kind that produces steady, responsible adults who go to university, get jobs, and quietly contribute to society. Those who knew Asami described her as introverted, but not withdrawn. She had friends, though her social circle wasn't wide. She preferred small gatherings to large parties, deep conversations to surface-level chatter. In high school, she'd been a solid student, not at the top of her class, but consistent, reliable. She liked reading, particularly fiction, and had a fondness for music, though she never learned to play an instrument herself. She was the kind of person who blended into the background, not because she lacked personality, but because she didn't demand attention. By the time she graduated high school in 2005, Asami had set her sights on higher education. She enrolled at a university in Tokyo, pursuing a degree in education. Her dream, she'd told family members, was to become a teacher. It was a modest ambition, but it fit her personality. Steady, nurturing, focused on helping others rather than chasing fame or fortune. She wanted to work with children to create the kind of stable, encouraging environment that she herself had experienced growing up. University life suited her. She wasn't the type to go out drinking every weekend or stay out until dawn at karaoke bars. Instead, she focused on her coursework, maintained a small but close-knit group of friends, and kept to a routine that her family found comforting. Every week, she'd call home, updating her parents on her classes, her part-time job at a bookstore, and the small details of her daily life. She was good about staying in touch. She was good about routines. By November 2007, Asami was in her third year of university. She'd settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, even comfortable. She lived alone in a small apartment in Saitama, close enough to her family that she could visit easily, but far enough to maintain her independence. Her apartment was modest, tidy, and organized in the way that reflected her personality. Nothing extravagant, nothing out of place. Friends who visited described it as welcoming but minimalist, a space that felt lived in but not cluttered. Her daily routine was almost clockwork. She'd wake up around 7, prepare a simple breakfast, and leave her apartment by 8 to catch the train. The commute to her university took roughly 50 minutes depending on connections, and she'd usually arrive on campus by 9, classes, library time, occasionally meeting friends for lunch, then back home in the evening. She'd work shifts at the bookstore a few times a week, always careful to balance her job with her studies. She wasn't struggling, she wasn't overwhelmed, she was managing. Emotionally, Asami seemed stable. There were no signs of depression, no dramatic shifts in behavior, no red flags that suggested she was contemplating anything drastic. She'd recently spoken to her mother about plans for the upcoming winter break, discussing whether she'd come home for the holidays. She'd mentioned a paper she was working on, a deadline she was trying to meet. These were the conversations of someone engaged with their life, someone planning for a future. But there was something else, something that wouldn't become clear until after she was gone. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Asami had been quieter than usual. Not withdrawn exactly, but more reserved. A friend would later mention that Asami had seemed distracted, as though something was weighing on her mind. When asked about it, Asami had brushed it off, saying she was just stressed about schoolwork. Another friend recalled that Asami had mentioned feeling watched on the train, though she hadn't elaborated. At the time, it seemed like the kind of vague unease that many young women in Tokyo experience, the uncomfortable awareness of being noticed in crowded public spaces. It didn't seem urgent. It didn't seem dangerous. In hindsight, those small comments carry a weight they didn't have at the time. But hindsight is always clearer than the present, and in the weeks before November 11th, no one thought Asami Chida was in danger. She was just a 21-year-old student navigating the challenges of university life, preparing for exams, and looking forward to going home for the holidays. She was ordinary, she was safe, or so everyone thought. To understand how Asami Chida could disappear, you need to understand the world she was moving through. Tokyo in 2007 was a city of contradictions, one of the safest major metropolitan areas on the planet, yet also one of the most isolating. With a population pushing 13 million in the city proper and over 37 million in the greater metropolitan area, Tokyo was, and still is, the largest urban area in the world. It's a place where you can be surrounded by people every moment of your day and still feel utterly alone. Japan as a whole has long held a reputation for low crime rates. In 2007, the country's homicide rate was among the lowest in the developed world, hovering around 0.5 per 100,000 people. Violent crime was rare enough to make headlines when it happened. The streets were clean, the trains ran on time, and the cultural emphasis on order, respect, and social harmony created an environment where most people felt safe walking alone at night. For young women like Asami, Tokyo wasn't perceived as a dangerous place. It was crowded, yes, and overwhelming at times, but not threatening. Yet beneath this veneer of safety, there were currents that told a different story. Japan's missing person statistics have always been quietly staggering. Every year, tens of thousands of people go missing in Japan. In 2007, that number was estimated at around 80,000 to 100,000 annually. Most are found within days or weeks. Many are elderly individuals with dementia wandering away from care facilities. Others are teenagers running away from home, usually returning after a brief absence. but a significant portion, several thousand each year, are never found. They simply vanish, leaving behind families with no answers and cases that grow colder with each passing year. This phenomenon is so common in Japan that there's a term for it, juhatsu, which translates roughly to evaporation. It refers to people who disappear intentionally, severing all ties with their previous lives and starting over in anonymity. Some flee debt, others escape abusive relationships or family pressure. In a society where shame and social expectations can be suffocating, disappearing can feel like the only option for those who feel trapped. But while juhatsu might explain some of Japan's missing person statistics, it doesn't explain all of them. And it certainly doesn't fit the profile of someone like Asami Chida. Tokyo's train system, the very infrastructure that Asami relied on every day, is a marvel of engineering and efficiency. The city's rail network is the busiest in the world, transporting over 8 million passengers daily across a web of interconnected lines operated by multiple companies. It's a system designed for speed and volume, where delays are measured in seconds and where millions of people move through stations like blood through arteries. The trains are crowded, especially during rush hour, packed so tightly that station staff sometimes have to physically push passengers into cars to make room. Privacy in such an environment is almost non-existent. You're pressed against strangers, breathing the same air, existing in the same physical space, yet remaining utterly anonymous. This anonymity is both the system's strength and its danger. In a crowd of hundreds, you're never truly alone, but you're also never truly seen. Witnesses are everywhere and nowhere. Surveillance cameras in 2007 were becoming more common, but weren't yet ubiquitous. Many smaller stations had minimal coverage, and even in larger stations, the sheer volume of people made it nearly impossible to track any single individual through the network. You could disappear in a crowd without anyone noticing you were gone. For women in Tokyo, the train system also carried another darker reality, chikan, or groping. Sexual harassment on trains was, and remains, a significant problem in Japan. The crowded conditions provided cover for predators who would take advantage of the pressed bodies and limited mobility to assault women. It was so common that by 2007, many train lines had introduced women-only cars during rush hour. But these measures were relatively new, and not all lines had them. For many women, the daily commute involved a constant vigilance, an awareness that any crowded train could become a space of violation. Asami's route from her apartment in Saitama to her university in Tokyo required at least one transfer, possibly two, depending on which lines were running smoothly that day. She would have started on a local line, likely the JR Saikyo line or JR Keihin Tohoku line, both of which connected Saitama to central Tokyo. From there, she'd transfer to another line that would take her closer to her campus. The journey was routine, predictable, and mostly uneventful. She'd done it hundreds of times. It was as natural to her as breathing. But the commute also meant that for nearly an hour each day, Asami was in transit, moving through a system that connected millions of people but recorded almost nothing about their individual movements. Unless someone specifically remembered seeing her, unless she used a specific ticket gate at a specific time, there would be no record of where she'd been or where she'd gone. In a system designed for anonymity, vanishing was easier than it should have been. The social climate in 2007 Japan also played a role in how disappearances were perceived and investigated. Japanese culture places a high value on not causing trouble, on maintaining harmony, and on not drawing attention to oneself. This cultural trait, while fostering order and respect, could also create reluctance to report concerns or intervene in situations that seemed unusual. If someone saw something strange, they might hesitate to speak up, not wanting to make a scene or be wrong. Bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to help when others are present, was amplified in Tokyo's crowded spaces. Additionally, there was a societal reluctance to acknowledge certain uncomfortable truths. While Japan prided itself on being safe, there was less public discourse about the dangers that did exist, particularly for women. Stalking, harassment, and violence against women were often underreported and minimized. When women did disappear, there was sometimes an assumption that they'd left voluntarily, that they were engaging in juhatsu, rather than being victims of foul play. This assumption could delay investigations and shift the focus away from criminal possibilities. In Asami's case, these cultural and structural factors would become significant. The very systems that were supposed to keep her safe, the efficiency of the trains, the density of the population, the surveillance infrastructure, all proved inadequate. She was moving through a world that was simultaneously hyper-organized and deeply impersonal, a place where millions of lives intersected daily without ever truly connecting. It was a world where you could scream and no one would hear you, not because they couldn't, but because the noise of existence was so constant that individual cries became indistinguishable from the background hum. November 2007 was unseasonably mild in Tokyo. The autumn chill had settled in, but it wasn't yet the biting cold of winter. The ginkgo trees that lined many of the city's streets had turned brilliant yellow, their leaves carpeting the sidewalks in golden drifts. It was the kind of weather that made the morning commute almost pleasant, crisp but not uncomfortable, the air clean and sharp. For Asami, the first week of November had been busy but manageable. She was in the middle of midterm season, with several exams and papers due before the end of the month. She'd been spending more time than usual in the university library, often staying late into the evening to study or work on assignments. Her friends noticed she seemed more focused than usual, perhaps a bit more stressed, but nothing that raised alarm. University students everywhere experience waves of pressure, and this seemed like one of those times. On November 5th, 6 days before her disappearance, Asami had called her mother. It was a routine check-in, the kind they had every week or so. They talked about mundane things, how classes were going, whether Asami was eating properly, plans for the upcoming holidays. Her mother would later recall that Asami sounded tired but normal. There was no sense of distress, no cryptic comments, no goodbyes that felt heavier than they should. It was just a conversation, the kind they'd had dozens of times before. But there was one thing Asami mentioned that stuck with her mother, though at the time it didn't seem particularly important. Asami said she'd been having trouble sleeping. She didn't elaborate much, just mentioned that she'd been waking up in the middle of the night and finding it hard to fall back asleep. Her mother asked if she was stressed about school, and Asami said maybe, but she didn't seem overly concerned. Insomnia wasn't unusual for a university student during exam season. It was easy to dismiss. Over the next few days, Asami maintained her routine. She attended classes, worked her shifts at the bookstore, and spent hours studying. On November 7th, she met with a small group of classmates at a coffee shop near campus to work on a group project. One of those classmates would later tell investigators that Asami seemed distracted during the meeting. When asked if she was okay, Asami had said she was fine, just tired. The group had worked for about 2 hours before dispersing, and Asami had taken the train home alone, just as she always did. November 8th was a Thursday, and Asami had a shift at the bookstore in the evening. Her supervisor would later describe her as being her usual self, quiet, polite, efficient. She shelved books, helped customers, and left when her shift ended around 8 in the evening. Nothing about her behavior stood out. Nothing suggested this was a person on the brink of disappearing. The weekend of November 9th and 10th is where things become slightly murkier. Asami had no classes on those days, and it's unclear exactly how she spent her time. Her roommate, a detail that hasn't been widely reported but that emerges in some accounts, mentioned that Asami had been home most of the weekend, studying in her room. They'd crossed paths a few times, exchanged pleasantries, but hadn't had any deep conversations. Asami had gone out at some point on Saturday, possibly to run errands or grab food, but she'd been back by evening. On Sunday, she'd stayed in almost entirely, working on a paper that was due the following week. But there was one moment from that Sunday that would later take on a darker significance. Late in the evening, around 10 or 11, Asami had received a phone call. Her roommate couldn't hear the conversation through the walls, but she remembered hearing Asami's voice, soft and measured, speaking to someone for about 15 or 20 minutes. When the call ended, Asami had gone to the bathroom, then returned to her room for the night. The roommate didn't think much of it. Asami received calls occasionally, usually from family or friends. There was no reason to think this one was different, except that when investigators later tried to trace that call, they hit a wall. Asami's phone records showed an incoming call that evening, but the number was from a prepaid cell phone, the kind that doesn't require registration in Japan and can be purchased anonymously. The call had lasted 17 minutes, and the number was never used again. It was activated, used once, and then discarded. To this day, no one knows who was on the other end of that line or what was said. On the morning of November 11th, Asami woke up at her usual time. Her roommate was already gone, having left early for her own classes. Asami moved through her morning routine: shower, breakfast, getting dressed. She chose a simple outfit, jeans and a dark sweater, practical and warm enough for the November chill. She packed her bag with her textbooks, notebooks, and laptop, the same items she carried every day. She slipped her phone into her pocket, grabbed her wallet and train pass, and locked the door behind her. It was approximately 7:50 a.m. when she left her apartment building. A neighbor saw her walking toward the station, her bag slung over one shoulder, earbuds in, the picture of a university student on her way to class. The neighbor would later tell police that Asami looked completely normal, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. She was just another face in the morning crowd, another person moving through the machinery of Tokyo's daily rhythm. And then she was gone. November 11th, 2007, a Monday morning, clear skies, temperature hovering around 12 degrees Celsius, light breeze from the east. In Tokyo, it was a day like any other, which is to say it was a day where millions of people moved through their routines with the precision of a synchronized machine. Asami Chida was one of those millions. She should have been unremarkable that day, just another student on a train, another person absorbed into the city's vast, anonymous flow. At approximately 7:50 a.m., as mentioned, Asami left her apartment. Her building was located about a 10-minute walk from the nearest train station. The route was straightforward: down her residential street, a left turn at the intersection, through a small shopping district that was just beginning to wake up, and then onto the main road that led to the station. It was a path she'd walked so many times that she could have done it blindfolded. By around 8:05 a.m., she should have reached the station. We say should have because this is where the timeline starts to fracture, where certainty gives way to gaps and questions. There are no confirmed sightings of Asami at the station that morning, no ticket gate records showing her entering, no surveillance footage capturing her on the platform. This doesn't necessarily mean she didn't make it to the station. Many stations, especially smaller ones in Saitama, had limited camera coverage in 2007, and with thousands of commuters passing through every hour, station staff couldn't be expected to remember any individual passenger. But it does mean that the last confirmed documented moment of Asami Chida's existence was her neighbor seeing her walking toward the station at approximately 7:52 a.m. Everything after that is reconstruction, assumption, and shadow. Her classes that day were scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. It was a lecture course held in one of the larger halls on campus, the kind of class where attendance was taken but not strictly enforced, where one empty seat among hundreds might not be immediately noticed. Asami was a consistent student. She rarely missed class, but on November 11th, her seat remained empty. Her friends noticed, but they didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was sick, maybe she'd overslept, maybe she'd decided to skip and catch up later. It happens. University students miss classes all the time. By the time the lecture ended around 10:30, a few classmates had exchanged glances, wondering where Asami was, but no one was concerned enough to reach out. Not yet. By early afternoon, however, concern was beginning to crystallize. Asami had missed not just one class, but two. She wasn't responding to text messages or phone calls. Her phone was ringing, which meant it was on, but she wasn't picking up. One friend, a young woman named Reiko, tried calling several times between noon and 2 p.m. Each time the call rang through to voicemail. Reiko left a message asking if Asami was okay, assuming she'd get a response soon. She never did. By late afternoon, around 4 or 5 p.m., Asami's absence had become noticeably strange. A group of her closer friends decided to stop by her apartment on their way home, just to check in. It was a gesture born more from curiosity than fear at that point. They arrived around 5:30 p.m. They knocked on her door. No answer. They knocked again, louder. Still nothing. One of them tried calling her phone while standing outside the door. They could hear it ringing inside the apartment. This was the moment when worry shifted into something sharper. If Asami's phone was in her apartment, but she'd left for class that morning, something didn't add up. They tried to peer through the windows, but the curtains were drawn. They considered contacting the building manager, but decided to wait a little longer. Maybe she'd come home soon. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But as evening turned into night and Asami still didn't appear, the friend group made the decision to contact her family. One of them called Asami's mother around 8 p.m. The conversation was awkward at first. They didn't want to worry her unnecessarily, but they explained that Asami hadn't been at school, wasn't answering her phone, and that they were concerned. Asami's mother, upon hearing this, felt a cold spike of fear. She immediately tried calling Asami herself. The phone rang, but no answer. Within an hour, Asami's father had driven to her apartment. He arrived around 9 p.m., accompanied by the building manager, who agreed to unlock the door. When they stepped inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. The apartment was neat and tidy, just as Asami always kept it. Her laptop was on her desk. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, plugged into a charger. Her wallet was gone, and so was her bag. Her keys were also missing, but the apartment showed no signs of a struggle, no indications that anything violent or chaotic had occurred within its walls. The realization hit with sickening clarity. Asami had left that morning as planned. She had taken her essentials with her, but she had never made it to school. And somewhere between her apartment door and her classroom, she had vanished. Asami's father called the police immediately. The initial response was measured, almost frustratingly so. The officer who took the report explained that Asami was an adult, that adults sometimes go off on their own for various reasons, and that unless there was evidence of foul play, there wasn't much they could do in the first 24 hours. It's a standard response, one designed to prevent police resources from being wasted on cases where the missing person is simply out of touch temporarily. But for a family facing the sudden, inexplicable absence of a loved one, it felt like bureaucratic indifference. Still, the officer took down the details. A missing person report was filed. Asami's description was entered into the system. 21 years old, approximately 158 centimeters tall, slim build, shoulder-length black hair, last seen wearing jeans, a dark sweater, and carrying a brown shoulder bag. The report noted that she was a university student, that she had left for class that morning, and that she had not been seen or heard from since. By midnight, the reality had fully sunk in. Asami Chida was missing. Not lost, not confused, missing. And no one had any idea what had happened to her. The first 48 hours after someone goes missing are often described as the most critical. Memories are fresh, trails haven't yet gone cold, and there's still a chance that the person might be found quickly, confused or injured, but alive. For Asami Chida, those first 48 hours were consumed by frantic activity from her family and friends, but a slower, more methodical response from law enforcement. On the morning of November 12th, Asami's family began retracing her steps. Her father, accompanied by her brother, walked the route from her apartment to the train station. They showed her photo to shopkeepers and pedestrians, asking if anyone had seen her the previous morning. Most people shook their heads. One shop owner thought maybe he'd seen someone matching her description, but he wasn't sure. It might have been her. It might have been any of the dozens of young women who passed by his store every morning. At the train station, they encountered their first significant obstacle. The station staff were sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. They explained that without a specific time and location, it would be nearly impossible to review surveillance footage. The station had cameras, but not everywhere, and the volume of footage generated every day meant that it would take hours, possibly days, to review it all. And even then, identifying one person among thousands, especially if she'd been wearing unremarkable clothes and hadn't done anything to stand out, would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Asami's family pushed harder. They insisted that this was urgent, that their daughter was missing, that something was clearly wrong. The station manager eventually agreed to have staff review footage from the morning of November 11th, focusing on the hours between 7:30 a.m. and 9 a.m. It was a painstaking process. Hours of grainy video, countless faces, bodies moving in and out of frame. And in the end, they found nothing definitive. There were several young women who vaguely resembled Asami, but none that could be positively identified as her. This was the first of many dead ends. Without concrete evidence that Asami had entered the station, it became difficult to establish where she'd gone after leaving her apartment. Had she made it to the station at all? Had something happened on the walk there? Or had she boarded a train and then something occurred during her commute? Meanwhile, police were conducting their own investigation, though with a different pace and priority. Asami's case was classified as a missing person, but without evidence of abduction or violence, it didn't immediately trigger a large-scale search operation. The assigned detective, whose name has not been widely publicized, began by interviewing Asami's family and friends. What was her state of mind? Did she have any reason to leave voluntarily? Were there any conflicts in her life? Any debts? Any relationships that might have gone sour? The answers were uniformly negative. Everyone who knew Asami described her as stable, responsible, and unlikely to disappear without warning. There were no known conflicts, no financial problems, no secret relationships. She wasn't dating anyone at the time. She didn't have enemies. By all accounts, she was simply a diligent student trying to finish her degree and build a future. But the police weren't entirely convinced. In Japan, the phenomenon of juhatsu, voluntary disappearance, was well known, and investigators were trained to consider it as a possibility in missing person cases. Young people, especially those facing pressure or struggling with mental health issues, sometimes chose to walk away from their lives. It was rare, but it happened. And in the absence of evidence pointing to foul play, it was an explanation that couldn't be dismissed. This tension between the family's certainty that something terrible had happened and the police's inclination to wait for more evidence would define the early days of the investigation. Asami's mother, desperate and increasingly frantic, began organizing search parties with the help of friends and volunteers. Flyers were printed with Asami's photo and description and distributed across Saitama and Tokyo. The family set up a tip line, hoping that someone, somewhere, had seen something. Tips did come in, but they were frustratingly vague. Someone thought they'd seen a young woman matching Asami's description near a different train station on November 11th, but the timing didn't match. Another person called to say they'd seen someone who looked like Asami getting into a car with a man. But when investigators followed up, the lead went nowhere. The woman in question had been someone else entirely. The media began to pick up the story around November 15th, 4 days after Asami's disappearance. Local news outlets ran brief segments about the missing university student, showing her photo and asking anyone with information to come forward. But in a city as large as Tokyo, where news cycles move quickly and tragedies are unfortunately common, Asami's case didn't receive the kind of widespread attention that might have generated substantial leads. It was a story, yes, but one among many. When a person goes missing in Japan, the investigation process can be both meticulous and maddeningly slow. Japanese law enforcement operates within a system that values thoroughness and procedure, but this can sometimes mean that cases which don't fit neatly into established categories receive less aggressive pursuit. Asami Chida's case fell into this grey area. Clearly something had happened to her, but without evidence of a specific crime, the investigation struggled to gain traction. By December 2007, roughly a month after her disappearance, the police had interviewed dozens of people, family members, friends, classmates, professors, co-workers at the bookstore, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances. The picture that emerged was consistent but unhelpful. Asami was responsible, kind, unremarkable in the best possible way. No one had any reason to harm her. No one had any reason to think she'd leave voluntarily. But interviews and impressions weren't evidence. What the police needed was something concrete. A witness who had seen her after she left her apartment. A piece of physical evidence that could point toward a suspect, or a digital trail that could reveal where she'd gone. They had none of these things. The surveillance footage from the train station remained inconclusive. Investigators had reviewed hours of tape, cross-referencing the timestamps with the estimated time Asami would have arrived. They identified several young women who could potentially have been her, but the footage quality was poor, the angles were bad, and positive identification was impossible. Even if they had spotted her entering the station, it would only confirm that she'd made it that far, not what happened afterward. The train lines themselves presented another challenge. Asami's commute required at least one transfer, possibly two, meaning she would have passed through multiple stations operated by different rail companies. Each company had its own surveillance system, its own record-keeping methods, its own level of cooperation with police. Coordinating access to footage across multiple companies, each with its own bureaucracy, was a slow and frustrating process. Moreover, ticket gate data proved to be a dead end. While modern Japanese train systems can track individual passengers through IC card usage, the data is typically only stored for a limited period and is not easy to access retroactively, especially if authorities don't know exactly which card they're looking for. Asami used a standard commuter pass, which recorded her entry and exit at stations, but this data had to be requested formally, and by the time investigators got around to it, the relevant records were already overwritten by newer transactions. The mysterious phone call from November 10th remained the most intriguing piece of evidence, but it was also the most frustrating. The prepaid phone had been used for one call, and then never again. Police contacted the electronics store where the phone had been purchased, hoping to find surveillance footage of the buyer, but the store's cameras hadn't been working that day. A coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps the buyer had known that and chosen that specific time and location deliberately. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the conversation through other means. They checked Asami's phone to see if she'd mentioned the call to anyone afterward. She hadn't. They asked her roommate if Asami had seemed upset or strange after the call. She didn't remember anything unusual. They questioned friends about whether Asami had mentioned receiving calls from unknown numbers. No one recalled her saying anything about it. This led to a critical question. If the call was benign, a wrong number, or a simple conversation, why had the caller used an untraceable prepaid phone? And if the call was significant, possibly even related to her disappearance, why had Asami not mentioned it to anyone? Was she keeping a secret? Was she being threatened? Or was the call completely unrelated, just a strange coincidence that investigators were reading too much into? In Japan, stalking and harassment cases were, and still are, a significant concern, though they often go underreported due to cultural stigma and a legal system that has historically been slow to take such complaints seriously. When investigators looked into whether Asami might have been stalked, they found some concerning threads, though nothing definitive. A few of her friends mentioned that Asami had, in recent weeks, commented about feeling watched on the train. She'd never pointed to a specific individual or filed a police report, but the feeling had been there. This was not uncommon. Many women in Tokyo experience unwanted attention on public transportation, and the culture of not making a scene often prevents them from confronting or reporting their harassers. But it raised the possibility that someone had been targeting Asami, watching her routine, learning her schedule. If that were true, her disappearance might not have been random at all. It might have been planned. Police began looking into known offenders in the area, individuals with histories of stalking, assault, or other predatory behavior. They cross-referenced locations and timelines looking for overlaps with Asami's movements. They identified a few individuals of interest, men who lived or worked near Asami's apartment or along her commute route, and who had prior records. Each was questioned. Each denied any involvement. And without physical evidence or witness testimony linking any of them to Asami, the investigation couldn't progress further down that path. Another theory that emerged was the possibility of human trafficking. Japan, despite its reputation for safety, has had issues with organized crime groups, yakuza, involvement in trafficking and exploitation. Young women, particularly those who appear vulnerable or alone, can be targets. The idea that Asami might have been abducted and forced into the sex trade was a horrifying one, but it couldn't be ruled out. Investigators reached out to organizations that worked with trafficking victims and law enforcement units that specialized in organized crime. They shared Asami's photo and details, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything. The response was silence. If Asami had been taken by traffickers, she'd vanished without a trace, leaving no leads for authorities to follow. As the investigation stretched into 2008, the case began to go cold. Not officially, but practically. Police were still nominally looking into it, but without new leads, there was little they could do. The file remained open, and occasionally a detective would follow up on a new tip or revisit old evidence, but the day-to-day intensity had faded. Asami Chida was becoming another name in a long list of unsolved disappearances, another person who had walked out into the world and never come back. Certain details about Asami's case refuse to settle into neat explanations. They linger, sharp and uncomfortable, resisting attempts to rationalize them away. These are the elements that true crime enthusiasts fixate on, the threads that investigators pull at in the middle of the night, hoping that one might finally unravel the whole mystery. First, is the question of her phone. When police and her family entered her apartment on the evening of November 11th, they found her phone sitting on the kitchen counter, plugged into a charger. This is strange. Asami had left for class that morning. Why would she have left her phone behind? For a 21-year-old university student in 2007, a phone was an essential item, especially when commuting alone in a large city. Most people would notice immediately if they'd left without it and would return to retrieve it. Some have suggested that Asami might have deliberately left her phone behind because she planned to disappear voluntarily. But this doesn't fit with everything else about her. She took her wallet, her bag, her keys. Why take those items but leave the one device that allows communication? Others have theorized that she might have been abducted from her apartment before she could grab her phone, but there were no signs of a struggle, and neighbors didn't report hearing anything unusual. Another possibility, darker and more unsettling, is that she did take her phone with her initially, but at some point between leaving her apartment and disappearing, she was intercepted and forced to return and leave the phone behind. Perhaps someone was waiting for her outside the building. Perhaps they convinced or coerced her into going back inside briefly. But this theory requires a level of premeditation and control that seems almost cinematic, and yet it's the only explanation that accounts for both the phone being left behind and her clearly having intended to leave for class. Then there's the matter of the wallet and bag. These items have never been found. If Asami had been the victim of a random attack, it's possible her belongings were stolen or discarded. But if her wallet and bag were taken, where are they? Tokyo's rivers and parks have been searched over the years, and no trace of her possessions has ever surfaced. If they were thrown away, why haven't they turned up in a landfill or been found by chance? Personal items have a way of resurfacing, but Asami's have not. The timeline itself is another source of frustration. The last confirmed sighting of Asami was around 7:52 a.m. by her neighbor, who saw her walking toward the train station. The station is a 10-minute walk away. She should have arrived by approximately 8:05 a.m., but there's no evidence that she ever got there. This leaves a roughly 10 to 15-minute window during which something happened. Did she encounter someone on the street? Did she get into a vehicle? Was she lured or forced into a building? The route from her apartment to the station has been walked and examined countless times by investigators, family members, and even amateur sleuths. It's a relatively busy area, with shops and residences lining the streets. Even early in the morning there would have been people around, shopkeepers opening up, other commuters heading to the station, delivery drivers making their rounds. How does someone disappear from a populated street without anyone noticing? How does an abduction occur in broad daylight with no witnesses? Unless it didn't look like an abduction. Unless it looked like a young woman getting into a car with someone she knew. Unless it looked like a conversation, a brief interaction, nothing worth remembering or reporting. This is where the psychology of urban anonymity becomes critical. In a city like Tokyo, people are conditioned to mind their own business. Even if someone had seen Asami talking to a stranger or getting into a car, they might not have thought anything of it at the time. And by the time she was reported missing, any such sighting would have been days old, forgotten in the constant churn of daily life. The prepaid phone call from November 10th remains the most tantalizing clue. 17 minutes is a long conversation, too long for a wrong number or a sales call. Someone wanted to talk to Asami, someone who went to the trouble of obtaining an untraceable phone specifically for that purpose. What did they say? What did they want? One theory is that the caller was setting up a meeting. Perhaps they convinced Asami to meet them somewhere, which could explain why she deviated from her normal route to the station. But if that's true, why didn't she tell anyone? Was she ashamed of the meeting? Was she afraid? Or was the meeting itself innocuous, something she didn't think warranted mention, only to have it turn dangerous unexpectedly? Another theory is that the call was a threat. Perhaps the caller was someone stalking Asami, and they used the call to frighten her or make demands. But again, if she'd been threatened, why didn't she go to the police or confide in someone? Was she too scared? Was she worried no one would take her seriously? Or was the threat veiled, subtle enough that she didn't recognize it as dangerous until it was too late? There's also the possibility that the call is a red herring, that it has nothing to do with her disappearance at all. Maybe it was a friend using a borrowed phone, or a classmate calling from a phone they'd found. Maybe the 17 minutes was spent on something entirely mundane. But the fact that the phone was never used again suggests otherwise. Someone wanted to contact Asami without being traced, and they succeeded. Then there's the question of motive. If Asami was taken, why? She wasn't wealthy. She had no powerful connections. She wasn't involved in anything criminal or controversial. What would anyone gain from abducting her? Ransom doesn't make sense. Her family was never contacted with demands. Trafficking is a possibility, but trafficking victims are typically taken in ways that leave some trace, and the lack of evidence in Asami's case is unusual even for that scenario. Sexual violence is another grim possibility. Though investigators found no evidence of sexual assault or murder, no body has ever been discovered, no DNA evidence linking her to a specific location or individual. If she was killed, where is she? Tokyo is a massive, densely developed city, but it's not easy to hide a body permanently. Searches of parks, rivers, forests, and abandoned buildings in the surrounding areas have turned up nothing. Could she be alive? 17 years later, it's a question that her family still grapples with. If she was taken by someone and is being held against her will, it would explain the lack of a body. It would mean she's out there somewhere, alive but imprisoned, unable to contact anyone. It's a horrifying thought, but for a family with no answers, it's sometimes preferable to the alternative. Over the years, various theories about Asami Chida's disappearance have circulated in true crime communities, online forums, and among those who've followed the case closely. Some are grounded in logical deduction, others veer into speculation, and a few border on the fantastical. Here we examine the most persistent theories, weighing their plausibility against the available evidence. Theory 1. Targeted abduction by a stalker. This is perhaps the most widely believed theory, and it's supported by a few key pieces of evidence. Asami had mentioned to friends that she'd felt watched on the train in the weeks before her disappearance. While she never identified a specific individual, the fact that she expressed this concern suggests it was more than just general paranoia. In Japan, chikan and stalking on public transportation are well-documented problems, and it's entirely plausible that someone fixated on Asami learned her routine and planned to abduct her. The prepaid phone call fits this theory. A stalker might have used an untraceable phone to contact Asami, perhaps to threaten her, manipulate her, or arrange a meeting under false pretenses. The call occurring the night before her disappearance is suspicious timing. If the caller was indeed a stalker, they might have used the conversation to gauge her state of mind, confirm her schedule, or even lure her to a specific location. The lack of evidence at the scene, whether it's her apartment or the route to the station, could be explained by careful planning. A stalker who had been watching Asami for weeks would know when and where to strike to minimize the risk of witnesses. They'd know she walked to the station alone, that the early morning streets were relatively quiet, and that a brief interaction with a seemingly friendly stranger wouldn't raise alarms. Against this theory is the absence of any identified suspect. Police investigated known offenders in the area, and found no one with a clear connection to Asami. Of course, this doesn't mean the stalker didn't exist. It just means they were careful enough not to leave a trail. Stalkers can be intelligent, methodical, and patient. They can blend into crowds, appear harmless, and avoid detection for long periods. The lack of a suspect doesn't disprove the theory, it just makes it harder to confirm. Theory 2. Human trafficking. Japan's organized crime networks, particularly Yakuza groups, have been involved in human trafficking, though the scale and methods vary. Young women, especially those who appear to be alone or vulnerable, can be targeted for forced labor or sexual exploitation. Asami, a university student living alone and commuting regularly on predictable routes, could have been identified as a potential victim. Trafficking operations often involve careful surveillance and planning. The abduction itself might be swift and efficient, carried out by multiple individuals working in coordination. Once a victim is taken, they can be moved quickly, transported to a different city, or even out of the country, where they disappear into the shadows of the criminal underworld. This theory would explain the complete lack of evidence. If Asami was taken by a professional trafficking ring, her abductors would be experienced in covering their tracks. They'd know how to avoid surveillance, how to dispose of evidence, and how to ensure their victim couldn't be traced. The prepaid phone call might have been part of the operation, a way to manipulate Asami into lowering her guard or agreeing to meet someone. However, trafficking victims often leave some trace, even if it's minimal. Witnesses might report seeing a woman being forced into a vehicle. Friends or acquaintances might recall the victim mentioning suspicious encounters or offers that seemed too good to be true. In Asami's case, there's nothing. No one saw her being taken. No one reported anything unusual. For a trafficking operation to be this clean, it would have to be exceptionally sophisticated. Moreover, the Japanese police have worked with anti-trafficking organizations to monitor such activities, and Asami's case has been shared widely within those networks. If she'd been taken by traffickers and had surfaced in any way, there's a reasonable chance someone would have recognized her. The fact that no such sighting has ever been confirmed is concerning. Theory 3. She was killed, and her body. Hidden if Asami was murdered, the question becomes, where is she? Bodies are difficult to hide permanently, especially in a place as densely populated as Tokyo, but it's not impossible. There are forests, mountains, and rural areas within a few hours' drive of the city where a body could be concealed. If her killer had access to a vehicle and knew the area well, they could have transported her remains to a remote location where they might never be found. Alternatively, her body could have been disposed of in water. Tokyo Bay, the Arakawa River, and other bodies of water in the region have been used to conceal evidence in the past. However, bodies in water typically resurface eventually, and extensive searches of these areas over the years have turned up nothing related to Asami. There's also the grim possibility that her body was destroyed, either through incineration or some other method. While this is difficult to do without drawing attention, it's not impossible, especially if the perpetrator had access to industrial equipment or a location where such activity wouldn't be noticed. This theory aligns with the evidence in some ways. If Asami was killed shortly after leaving her apartment, it would explain why there's no trace of her after that morning. It would explain why her wallet and bag have never been found. They could have been disposed of along with her body. And it would explain the silence. Dead women don't send messages or make calls. But without a body, this theory remains just that, a theory. And for her family, the lack of a body means the lack of closure, the inability to properly grieve, and the lingering, torturous hope that she might still be alive somewhere. Theory 4. Voluntary disappearance. This is the theory that law enforcement initially leaned toward, and it's the one that Asami's family vehemently rejects. The idea is that Asami, for reasons known only to her, chose to disappear. Perhaps she was overwhelmed by academic pressure, by family expectations, or by some personal crisis that she didn't feel she could share. Perhaps she wanted to start over, to escape the constraints of her life and become someone new. Japan's phenomenon of juhatsu provides a cultural framework for this behavior. There are documented cases of people, including young adults, who simply walk away from their lives, severing all ties and vanishing into anonymity. Some go to live in remote areas, others blend into the urban landscape, taking on new identities and avoiding any official documentation. It's a way of disappearing that's uniquely suited to a society where it's possible to live on the margins without attracting too much attention. Against this theory is everything we know about Asami. She was responsible, connected to her family, and engaged with her life. She had plans, goals, and relationships she cared about. While it's true that people can conceal their inner turmoil, those closest to her saw no signs that she was considering such a drastic step. Moreover, voluntary disappearances typically involve some preparation, withdrawing money, packing belongings, leaving cryptic messages. Asami did none of these things. Her phone being left behind is sometimes cited as evidence of voluntary disappearance, the idea being that she didn't want to be tracked or contacted. But as discussed earlier, this doesn't align with her taking her wallet and other essentials. If she was planning to disappear, why leave the phone but take items that would be necessary for survival? Theory 5. Wrong place, wrong time. This is the theory that she was the victim of a random, opportunistic crime. Perhaps she crossed paths with someone who was violent, unstable, or desperate. Perhaps she witnessed something she shouldn't have and was silenced. Perhaps she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and her disappearance is the result of a chaotic, unplanned act rather than a calculated abduction. Random crimes are difficult to solve because they lack the connections and motives that investigators rely on to build cases. If Asami's disappearance was truly random, the perpetrator could be anyone: a stranger on the street, a fellow commuter, someone passing through the area who has since moved on. Without witnesses or evidence, such crimes can go unsolved indefinitely. This theory is both the most terrifying and the most frustrating. It suggests that Asami's disappearance wasn't personal, that she wasn't targeted or chosen, but that she simply had the misfortune of encountering someone dangerous at a vulnerable moment. It's a reminder that in a city of millions, danger can come from anywhere, at any time, without warning or reason. 17 years have passed since Asami Chida walked out of her apartment on that November morning. 17 years of searching, hoping, and grieving. Her case remains officially unsolved, classified as a missing person investigation with no active leads. Her family has never stopped looking for her. Her mother, now in her 60s, continues to speak publicly about Asami's case, giving interviews and appealing for information. She has aged visibly under the weight of uncertainty, her face lined with sorrow and exhaustion. In interviews, she speaks softly, her words measured, but beneath the calm exterior is a desperation that time has done nothing to diminish. Every year on November 11th, the anniversary of Asami's disappearance, her family holds a vigil. Friends, former classmates, and even strangers who've been moved by her story gather to remember her and to demand answers. They light candles, share memories, and distribute flyers, hoping that this will be the year someone comes forward with information. The Japanese media occasionally revisits the case, particularly on milestone anniversaries. Documentaries and news specials have been produced, rehashing the known facts and speculating about what might have happened. These programs often include emotional appeals from Asami's family, begging anyone with knowledge to speak up. But as the years pass, media interest wanes and Asami's story fades from public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies and more recent mysteries. Police maintain that the case is still open and that they would pursue any credible leads. But in practice, the investigation has stalled. The detectives originally assigned to the case have retired or moved on to other assignments. New leads are exceedingly rare. Occasionally, someone will call in a tip claiming to have seen a woman who looks like Asami, but these sightings invariably turn out to be false. Mistaken identity, wishful thinking, or deliberate hoaxes. In recent years, advances in technology have offered a glimmer of hope. DNA databases, improved surveillance systems, and digital forensics have solved cold cases that seemed unsolvable decades ago. Asami's family has provided DNA samples, hopeful that if her remains are ever found, she can be positively identified. But so far, nothing has come of it. There have been no arrests, no suspects publicly named, no trials. The mystery of Asami Chida's disappearance is as impenetrable now as it was in 2007. She is one of thousands of people who vanish in Japan each year, and her case serves as a stark reminder of how easy it is to disappear, even in a society as structured and monitored as Japan's. If you're listening to this, you're probably looking for an answer, a resolution, a moment where all the pieces click into place and the mystery is solved. But the truth about Asami Chida is that there is no answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She was 21 years old, a university student with dreams of becoming a teacher. She lived a quiet, unremarkable life, the kind that should have been safe and predictable. But on November 11th, 2007, she left her apartment and never came back. And in the 17 years since, no one has been able to explain why. Was she targeted by someone who'd been watching her, stalking her, waiting for the perfect moment? Was she taken by traffickers, lost to a criminal underworld that swallows people whole and leaves no trace? Was she killed and hidden so well that her body may never be found? Or did she, for reasons we can't fathom, choose to walk away from her life, leaving behind everyone who loved her? We don't know. And that not knowing is what makes this case so haunting, because Asami wasn't a statistic, she wasn't a case file, she was a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had favorite books and songs she hummed while walking. She had plans for the future and fears about the present. She existed, and then she didn't. Somewhere in Tokyo, someone might know what happened. Maybe they saw something that morning, a moment that seemed insignificant at the time, but could change everything. Maybe they were involved, either directly or indirectly, and they've carried the secret for 17 years. Maybe they've wanted to speak up but haven't found the courage. If that person is listening, Asami's family wants you to know that it's not too late. It will never be too late. The pain they've endured, the not knowing, is a burden that never lightens. Any information, no matter how small, could help. It could bring closure. It could bring justice. For the rest of us, Asami's story is a reminder of how fragile our sense of safety really is. We move through the world assuming we'll make it home, that the routines we follow daily will carry us from one day to the next without incident. But Asami followed her routine, and it didn't save her. She took the same route she'd taken hundreds of times, and somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. What happened to Asami Chida? 17 years later, that question still hangs in the air, unanswered and unresolved. And until someone comes forward, until some piece of evidence surfaces, until her story finds an ending, Asami remains frozen in that November morning, forever 21, forever missing, forever waiting to be found.